You wake to the sound of whispers in a chamber where no one dares speak. Shadows flicker against walls painted with scenes of gods birthing gods, bloodlines looping back into themselves like serpents devouring their own tails. And there, in the center of this silence, lies a body that should have embodied divine perfection, but instead, it is broken. The bones are twisted, the skull elongated, the mouth unable to close around teeth too malformed to chew. This is not the image of a god-king. This is the ruin of a bloodline poisoned by its own obsession with purity. They never told you this part of history. They told you Egypt was the land of gold, of pyramids that defied time, of pharaohs who ruled as gods upon the earth. But they did not tell you the cost of trying to be more than human. They did not tell you that behind the polished stone of the temples, behind the perfectly carved statues, there was rot in the royal blood. For generations, Egypt's rulers practiced a secret that was no secret at all. They married their sisters, their daughters, their nieces, again and again, each generation tightening the noose around their own veins. And the result was not divinity. It was disaster. Children born unable to walk. Heirs who trembled with seizures as priests called it, divine possession. Kings whose very skulls revealed the mark of corruption written in bone. Tutankhamun, the boy king the world romanticizes, could not even stand without pain. Over 100 canes buried with him testify to his broken body, a god in name, a cripple in reality. This was not a mistake. It was deliberate. They believed blood must never be diluted. They believed the gods demanded purity. But what happens when purity becomes poison? What happens when a family line circles back on itself until it collapses inward like a star imploding into blackness? You were never supposed to know this. Because if you see it clearly, if you understand how far the rulers of men will go to preserve their illusion of power, you begin to recognize the same pattern in every age. Power concentrates. Bloodlines tighten. Institutions fold in on themselves. And what emerges is never divine. It is monstrous. The Egyptians called it godhood. We call it genetic ruin. But underneath both words lies the same truth: when men try to ascend above humanity, they sink deeper into corruption. Imagine being born into a world where your life is already claimed, not by chance, not by love, but by ritual. Where the moment you draw your first breath, priests are already whispering who you must marry, your sister, your cousin, perhaps even your mother. Not because of desire, but because of duty to blood. This was not perversion in the eyes of the ancients. It was theology carved into the very bones of their civilization. The story begins in myth. Osiris married his sister Isis. Set married Nephthys. Shu and Tefnut, the children of the first god, coupled to produce the sky and the earth. Creation itself was born from divine incest, or so the Egyptians believed. And if the gods had done it, then so must their living avatars, the pharaohs. To step outside of that circle was blasphemy, a crime against cosmic order itself. The Nile might stop flooding. The sun might refuse to rise. The kingdom might collapse. So brother wed sister. Daughter became wife. Generations upon generations reenacted the same ritual, each union tightening the spiral of blood. Priests called it preserving the essence of the gods. But behind the incense, behind the hymns, the truth was uglier. The human body was cracking under the weight of divine arrogance. Amenhotep III took his sister Sitamon as wife and produced Akhenaten, the heretic king whose body itself became a heresy against human form. His skull stretched unnaturally long, his hips widened like a woman's, his stomach swelled, his limbs elongated. Artists were forced to abandon centuries of idealized forms, because the king's body simply could not be sculpted as perfect. His flesh demanded a new language of art, one that revealed what had been hidden too long. The god blood was eating itself alive. And yet, the people still bowed. Still worshipped. Still feared. Because questioning the pharaoh's divinity was punishable by death. Imagine living in a world where you can see with your own eyes that your ruler is broken, diseased, malformed, yet you must call him a god. This is the psychological prison of power. The truth can stand before you in plain sight, and still you must deny it. It wasn't just marriage. It wasn't just ritual. It was a control system, one that chained the minds of millions through myth, fear, and obedience. The body of the king was failing, but the illusion of the king was unbreakable. Picture this: the golden mask of Tutankhamun gleams in museums today, a flawless vision of eternity. But beneath that mask, the truth was grotesque. His bones told a story the priests could never allow the people to hear. He was born of a brother and a sister. He inherited not one curse, but many, fused together in his fragile frame. He limped through life on a clubfoot so severe that he could barely stand unaided. Over 100 canes were found buried with him, ranging from plain wooden supports to gilded staffs encrusted with jewels. Each was not a symbol of majesty, but of necessity. A king propped up by sticks. His skull carried the signs of hydrocephalus, fluid pressing against the brain, distorting his face, tormenting him with headaches that may have felt like the gods themselves hammering inside his skull. His spine curved unnaturally, his hips were misshapen, his teeth misaligned. This was no divine warrior, no living god. He was a child wrapped in ceremonial regalia, his weakness hidden beneath gold, his suffering concealed beneath incense and chants. When he entered the throne room, he struggled just to lift the crook and flail, the sacred symbols of kingship. It was his sister wife Ankhesenamun who steadied his hand, guiding him through the motions of sovereignty, while courtiers bowed their heads in silence, pretending not to see what they could not admit. Priests called his afflictions sacred trials. They said his broken body proved he carried the weight of the gods. But the truth is simpler, darker. He was the victim of a closed bloodline, condemned to carry the sins of generations who believed themselves above the natural order. His existence was not a triumph of divinity, but the slow unraveling of it. And when he died at 18, suddenly, violently, his body was treated not with reverence but with panic. Burned in places. Hastily embalmed. Sealed away before anyone could linger too long over the evidence. A shattered king buried beneath mountains of gold, as though the wealth of an empire could hide the weakness of his blood. This is the pattern you must see. The mask and the man are never the same. Power hides behind ritual, behind myth, behind spectacle. But underneath, it always rots. Deep inside the palaces of Thebes, scrolls were written that were never meant for common eyes. These papyri spoke of strange afflictions, recurring deformities, patterns that repeated generation after generation among the royal children. Clubfoot. Cleft palate. Curved spines. Seizures. Minds that wandered into madness. The Egyptians did not have the word genetics. But they saw the pattern. And they feared it. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, one of the earliest medical documents in human history, described conditions that today we would recognize as neurological disorders. Ancient physicians classified and catalogued what they called the curse of the god blood. They noticed that the children of brother and sister, of father and daughter, carried the same weaknesses, the same broken flesh. The pattern was undeniable. Yet no physician could speak it aloud in the presence of the throne. To name it was treason against the gods themselves. So the physicians became silent servants of illusion. They stitched, splinted, soothed, performed crude surgeries in secret. They built braces to straighten twisted limbs, devised potions to calm seizures, designed rituals that disguised medicine as magic. Every healing was presented as a divine miracle, every deformity framed as a sacred burden. The truth was there, written in ink and bone, but wrapped in incense and prayer so the people would never see it. Imagine the weight of that silence. Knowing the blood of kings was poisoned, yet being commanded to call it holy. Imagine being forced to watch a boy like Tutankhamun stumble through life, and to bow, to chant, to proclaim him a god while his body failed before your eyes. That is the power of institutions, to make men deny what their eyes confirm, to force obedience not only of action, but of perception itself. The priests and physicians understood that the bloodline was collapsing. But instead of breaking the cycle, they preserved it. Because the purity of the pharaoh's blood was not just religion, it was control. If the pharaoh's blood was not divine, then the priests were liars, the temples were frauds, the entire architecture of Egypt's authority would crumble. And so, generation after generation, the dynasty limped forward on twisted bones and broken bodies, held aloft not by strength, but by the collective denial of millions. This is where myth becomes a weapon. Not just a story of gods, but a tool to bind men's minds, to make them worship sickness as sanctity, and weakness as divinity. Akhenaten. His very name still unsettles historians. He was not like the pharaohs before him, nor the ones after. His body betrayed the secret his dynasty had tried to bury. The god blood had turned inward, corrupting flesh, warping mind, and bending the very religion of Egypt to his broken form. Look at the depictions left behind. Akhenaten's skull stretched long and alien. His hips rounded, his chest soft, his stomach swollen, his limbs elongated like reeds bent by the wind. To look upon him was to see something neither fully man nor fully woman, neither god nor mortal. The old artists could not shape him into the perfected ideal that had defined pharaohs for centuries. His deformities were too undeniable. And so Egyptian art itself was forced to change, abandoning the perfect geometry of the past to sketch the truth of what their king had become. His body rewrote the language of an entire civilization. But his body was not the only heresy. His mind, too, turned against the order that had preserved Egypt for millennia. He abandoned the gods of his ancestors, erased the names of Ammonius and Ra, and raised up a single deity, Aten, the sun itself, as the only god. Historians debate whether this was spiritual genius or madness. But when you peel back the layers, another possibility emerges. What if the neurological damage of inbreeding distorted not only his body, but his perception of reality itself? What if his visions were not revelations, but symptoms? His people whispered. Graffiti from his reign mocked him, the god-king walks like a woman, and speaks like a child. Yet none could speak too loudly. For though the body of the pharaoh was weak, the machinery of his power remained brutal. The priests bent reluctantly to his decrees, the nobles obeyed, the people bowed. Here lies the paradox: even when the god is visibly broken, the system continues to demand worship. Akhenaten's reign was short, but catastrophic. He drained Egypt's resources building a city to Aten, a city that crumbled as soon as he died. He left behind children born of his own bloodline, children already marked by the same twisted inheritance. Among them was Tutankhamun, the boy who would inherit not only the throne, but the curse. Do you see the pattern? It is never just one man. It is the system that sustains him. Even madness, even weakness, is exalted if it preserves the illusion of divine blood. The boy king lived in pain. But it was his death that revealed the most sinister truth. When Howard Carter opened his tomb in 1922, the world saw golden splendor. Masks, jewelry, treasures beyond imagination. Yet beneath the wealth lay something the priests had tried to erase. Tutankhamun's body had been burned. His embalming was rushed, his chest collapsed, his corpse mutilated in ways no pharaoh should have been. For years, scholars called it accident. Fire from the oils. Mistakes in mummification. But the deeper the science, the darker the truth became. CT scans revealed a skull fracture, a violent blow to the back of his head. His ribs shattered, not by time, but by force. Chemical traces of poison inside his remains. Was it a fall from a chariot? Or was it murder? The evidence tilts toward assassination. The boy who limped on canes, the boy with the spine of a cripple, the lungs of a weakling, the body of a victim, was struck down before he could even reach manhood. Why? Because weakness, no matter how dressed in gold, invites the predator. In a court of jackals, his fragility was a liability. Egypt needed a strong god, not a broken one. And so the god-king was silenced, his body destroyed before the people could see too clearly the truth that priests and nobles already knew: the bloodline had collapsed. Think about this. Tutankhamun was raised as a living god. His image carved into temples, his name sung in hymns, his throne said to be the very axis of heaven and earth. And yet in the end, he was disposable. One strike to the skull, one poisoned cup, one engineered accident, and the god crumbled into dust. His divinity was never real. His survival was never guaranteed. His bloodline, worshipped for centuries, ended in a violent whimper. And here lies the unspoken lesson: power cloaks itself in eternity, but it survives only as long as it serves the system. The moment weakness shows, even gods are discarded like broken statues. They buried him in gold, yes. But no amount of gold could cover the smell of fear. His tomb was a monument to denial, a glittering mask placed over the face of a boy murdered by the very system that called him divine. 300 years after Tutankhamun's bones turned to dust, Egypt fell to Alexander the Great. His general Ptolemy seized the throne, and with him began a new dynasty, Greek in blood, Egyptian in image, foreign yet desperate to appear eternal. And how did they prove their legitimacy? By embracing the darkest tradition Egypt had ever birthed: royal incest. But where the pharaohs had clothed it in myth, the Ptolemies stripped it bare as politics. They married brother to sister not for gods, but for power. To keep bloodlines closed. To preserve their Greek identity against the river of Egyptian millions. To prevent rivals from clawing their way into the throne. What began as theology now calcified into calculation. Ptolemy II set the standard when he divorced his wife to marry his own full sister, Arsinoe II. Not quietly, but with ceremony. Their union was celebrated as if Olympus itself had ordained it, blending Greek and Egyptian ritual into one spectacle of power. The people were forced to applaud, even as they knew the circle of blood was twisting tighter and tighter. And so it continued. Brothers married sisters. Uncles married nieces. Kings took daughters as wives. One after another, generation after generation, the family tree collapsed into itself until it resembled not a branching lineage but a spiral, a coil strangling its own descendants. By the time Cleopatra VII, the Cleopatra, seduced Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, her bloodline was so reduced, so folded in upon itself, that she had only 6 unique ancestors where a normal person would have 32. Imagine the cost of such concentration. The dynasty had reduced its genetic diversity to less than 20% of what it should have been. A family turned laboratory. A lineage strangled by design. And the results? Grotesque. Accounts describe rulers bloated beyond recognition, their flesh sagging, their minds fractured, their appetites unrestrained. Some were so obese they could not walk without attendants to carry their swollen weight. Others paranoid to the point of madness, murdering mothers, sisters, brothers in purges that left palaces drenched in blood. Their subjects whispered, as Polybius wrote, that the Ptolemaic court was a menagerie of human monsters masquerading as gods. Here, the cycle reached perfection: incest institutionalized, deformity normalized, madness ritualized. It was no longer an accident of theology, it was a policy of empire. The Ptolemies were not merely kings and queens. They were experiments in power stripped of restraint. Each generation birthed rulers less human than the last, not only in flesh but in mind. The records are chilling. Ptolemy IV, paranoid and sadistic, murdered his own mother, brother, and uncle in a single purge. He then married his sister Arsinoe III and forced her into ceremonies so bizarre that priests called it divine madness. His reign was marked not by greatness, but by cruelty fueled by fear. Ptolemy VIII was worse. Obese beyond recognition, his body swelled with disease and gluttony until he was nicknamed Fiskin, the potbelly. He sweated constantly, breathing like a beast, unable to sit long without collapsing. His paranoia turned palace walls into prisons. He killed his own son, dismembered him, and sent the pieces to his wife, who was also his sister. This was not merely corruption. It was degradation. Think about what this means. These rulers were worshipped as living gods. Yet their subjects watched them stagger under their own weight, bleed from their own excess, collapse into their own madness. And still, they bowed. Still, they called them divine. Fear made obedience stronger than sight. To disbelieve was death. Do you see the pattern yet? It is not just Egypt. It is not just antiquity. Power does not need to be sane, or strong, or even human. It only needs the machinery of obedience, temples, laws, armies, myths. Once those are in place, even monsters can rule as gods. And here is where I must speak directly to you. If you've followed me this far into the shadows, you already feel it. The descent is not about them alone, but about you. About what you are beginning to see in your own world. These stories are not dead. They are warnings written in bone. And now I will give you the phrase. To lock in the awareness, to seal the transformation, write this twice in the comments below. The mask rots. The blood betrays. Write it twice. Because once you see behind the mask, you cannot go back. Once you understand the bloodline always collapses, you begin to see the system for what it truly is, fragile, rotten, terrified of exposure. The Ptolemies did not escape the cycle. They sank deeper into it, until their dynasty consumed itself from within. Cleopatra 7. Her name drips with seduction, with myth, with legend. Hollywood paints her as a goddess of beauty, a temptress who brought Rome to its knees. But behind the jewels and the poetry was the same poisoned blood that had coursed through generations of inbreeding. Cleopatra was not simply the lover of Caesar and Antony. She was the product of centuries of genetic compression, a lineage that had been folded so many times it was paper thin. By her birth, the Ptolemies were grotesque in body and unstable in mind. Cleopatra herself was not the exotic beauty of silver screens. Coins of her reign reveal sharp features, a hooked nose, and an austere expression. Not ugly, but not divine. Her true power was not her face, but her mind. Where her ancestors bloated and murdered themselves into oblivion, Cleopatra turned degeneration into a weapon. She wrapped her fragility in theater. She transformed weakness into allure. Draped in gold, perfumed in incense, she sailed up the Nile on barges painted like floating temples, presenting herself as the living goddess Isis. Rome's generals, hardened men who had torn empires apart, became spellbound. Julius Caesar fathered her child. Mark Antony risked the wrath of Rome itself to kneel at her feet. But never forget, this was the last gasp of a dying dynasty. Cleopatra did not save Egypt. She used Rome's hunger as a shield, her body as a bargaining chip, her throne as a stage. When Caesar was assassinated, her mask cracked. When Antony fell at Actium, her illusion shattered. She took her own life rather than be paraded as a prisoner through Rome's streets. Her death was more than the end of a queen. It was the end of a lineage stretching back to Alexander, to pharaohs, to gods. A family that had once ruled like the sun, collapsed into incest, paranoia, and finally, suicide. Egypt was swallowed by Rome, its gods reduced to curiosities, its bloodlines extinguished in the dust of history. And yet, even in death, the illusion lingers. Cleopatra is still remembered as divine. Still worshipped as beauty incarnate. Still mythologized as more than human. This is the final, bitter lesson: even when the blood rots, even when the dynasty dies, the mask can outlive the flesh. What we inherit are not bones, but illusions. And illusions are harder to kill than kings. History tells us Cleopatra's death was the end of the line. But if you've walked with me through these chambers of decay, you know better. Dynasties die, but the system never does. Masks crumble, but the machinery of control finds a new face to wear. The pharaohs ruled through incest, myth, and bloodlines. The Ptolemies turned the ritual into policy. Rome devoured Egypt, and yet Rome itself became haunted by the same obsession: dynasties, emperors as gods, blood as the currency of power. When Rome fell, monarchs of Europe resurrected the same principle: divine right, the idea that rulers are chosen not by merit, but by lineage. Once again, the blood was sacred. Once again, the people bowed. Do you see the echo? The same pattern stretches forward, through kingdoms, through empires, even into the systems that govern you now. Family names passed like crowns. Networks of power so interwoven that the bloodlines of ancient kings still thread through modern palaces and boardrooms. Today, they may not call themselves gods. They may wear suits instead of golden crowns. But the logic has not changed: blood over merit, secrecy over truth, illusion over reality. The tragedy of Egypt is not locked in stone temples. It is alive wherever power convinces the masses to bow before illusions. Wherever leaders are worshipped not for their deeds, but for the symbols they wear. Wherever fear makes obedience stronger than truth. And that is why you were not meant to hear this. Because once you see the mask, it no longer holds power. Once you whisper the phrase, the mask rots. The blood betrays. You break the spell that has been cast for thousands of years. You awaken from the theater, and you begin to ask, who are the gods today? Whose bloodlines are you told to respect? Whose mask are you bowing to without realizing it? Cleopatra's death closed one book, but the next chapter was written immediately. Power does not die, it mutates. It survives by changing its costume, by slipping from pharaoh to emperor, from emperor to king, from king to politician, to tycoon, to leader. The faces change. The names change. But the mask remains. And if history teaches anything, it is this: every mask rots. Every bloodline betrays itself. And every empire, no matter how divine it claims to be, eventually falls into the dust. The only question is, will you still be bowing when it happens?